Hi, my name is Jonathan Drake. I'm Assistant Professor of Neurology at the Warren Alpert Medical School at Brown University and Associate Director of the Alzheimer's Disease and Memory Disorders Center here at Rhode Island Hospital. The title of my talk today is Risk and Resiliency, the New Era of Research in Alzheimer's Disease Prevention and Healthy Aging. First, I'm going to briefly define what Alzheimer's disease is and discuss the two sides of risk and resiliency. And I'm going to end the discussion with a description of two major prevention efforts that are happening internationally as well as locally. First, what is Alzheimer's disease? Generally, Alzheimer's disease is described as a slowly progressive neurodegenerative disorder that eventually leads to memory and thinking problems that disrupt daily life. It's important to also understand that that's actually the definition for dementia: memory and thinking problems that make it so somebody can't function independently anymore in daily life. There are a lot of typical signs of Alzheimer's disease, but typically it's defined as a disorder that affects short-term memory, so that's one of the main features, but also it can lead to difficulty with planning and problem solving and completing familiar daily tasks. People often have difficulty coming up with words when they're speaking, misplacing items, having poor judgment, and they can often have changes in personality and mood. We also tend to think of Alzheimer's disease as occurring over a very long time period. So there's a long phase where the pathology that builds up in the brain that I'll describe in a little bit builds up when somebody has no symptoms at all, eventually leading to dementia. But there's a prodromal phase in the middle where somebody has mild cognitive impairment, as we call it, where people are having a little bit more difficulty with daily functioning, but they're mostly independent and eventually progress to dementia. So it sounds pretty simple, right? Actually, not so much. The actual cause of Alzheimer's disease turns out to be a lot more complicated and has been debated for over a century since Dr. Alzheimer's first described the classic pathologic lesions that define the disease in the brain. Still don't have a full understanding what Alzheimer's disease is, but generally, you can think of Alzheimer's disease in two ways. One would be in terms of this clinical syndrome. So what I described, a collection of symptoms that we typically associate with Alzheimer's disease. Another way to think about it is as a slowly progressive neurodegenerative disorder. This is with the brain changes, such as with amyloid and tau protein buildup in the brain, which I'll get up to in a little bit. It's important to remember that, again, this is a slowly progressive process, no matter how you look at it. This is actually what an Alzheimer's disease brain looks like. And this very graphically illustrates what a neurodegenerative disorder looks like. The brain on the right is a rather severe looking Alzheimer's brain. The brain on the left is a normal brain. And you can see you don't have to be a neurologist or a neuropathologist to recognize that there's a big difference between these two brains. I'm going to point out a particularly important structure for us who evaluate memory disorders, and this is called the hippocampus, and the yellow arrow here. That's part of the brain that's primarily responsible for short-term memory, and it happens to be one of the parts of the brain that's affected earliest on in Alzheimer's disease, which is why some of the earliest symptoms are memory loss. In terms of the brain pathology that happens in Alzheimer's disease, there are a whole bunch of things that happen, but amyloid and tau protein, abnormal buildup of these proteins is what defines the disease in terms of brain changes. They're all important. I'm mostly going to be discussing amyloid today because it's most relevant to our discussion. But if you look over on the right here, this is actually what it looks like under the microscope in a brain. These kind of reddish areas here are clumps of amyloid protein that occurs around various types of brain cells, and the tau protein builds up in tangles within nerve cells, and you can see that here at the end of this blue dashed arrow. It's also important to understand that part of the reason that the clinical syndrome, so the short-term memory loss, the word finding difficulty and such, part of the reason that that exists in Alzheimer's disease is because of what parts of the brain are affected. Over here on the right, you can see this blue structure here. That's actually what the hippocampus looks like, more in 3 dimensions. So if you can imagine, this is sitting in the center of the brain, and over on the left here, all these stipples in the brain illustrate where the pathology in Alzheimer's disease tends to occur. So we tend to generally think of it starting in this area called the temporal lobe. So this is where short-term memory and language function lives. And classically, in terms of our understanding of Alzheimer's disease, it spreads up here to this part of the brain, the parietal lobe, and eventually to the frontal lobe. So you get the memory, language problems, visual spatial problems, and eventually the frontal lobe is responsible for planning and organization and also behavior and things like that. So that's why we get this clinical syndrome. This is kind of a complicated slide, but I thought it was important to just illustrate to you just how much pathology there is in the brain. This is from a classic paper that a neuropathologist published back in the early 90s. And what it's looking at, so this is actually a slice of that hippocampus I was talking about. And we think of 6 different stages in terms of the buildup of these proteins. You can see no pathology up here, and you start to see these stars and little dots. These are the tau tangles, these are the amyloid plaques, and you can see over time it builds up. So when you get to the most severe stage, stage 6 here, hippocampus is literally riddled with tau tangles and amyloid plaques. So this has all led over the years to a number of theories of what Alzheimer's disease is, but the generally most accepted hypothesis or theory of what Alzheimer's disease looks something like this. So as we age, we have pathology building up in our brain in terms of amyloid and tau that starts long before we start to have memory symptoms, possibly even decades. So first, it's thought that amyloid protein builds up in the brain, which eventually leads to this tau protein building up, eventually leading to this neurodegeneration that I showed you. And it takes all of that to happen before you start to have the first signs of memory impairment and then eventual dementia with loss of ability to be able to function in daily life. So again, this is just depicting, this is a real important point for this talk. This stuff is happening for possibly decades before you even have the most subtle signs of any memory loss. Now it makes sense, right? We've got this logical progression of pathology that leads to the clinical syndrome, but as you might guess, it's not quite that straightforward. So there have been many observations over the years in terms of aging, what's normal aging, what isn't, the buildup in biology of this amyloid protein and clinical dementia that really challenge this straightforward notion of what Alzheimer's disease is. One factor is simply that some degree of memory loss is considered to be a perfectly normal part of aging. Another factor is not everyone who has clinical symptoms of Alzheimer's disease actually has amyloid in the brain. And the flip side of that is not everybody who has amyloid in the brain has memory loss or dementia. Also, there are other neurodegenerative disorders, strokes, other kinds of disorders that can cause very similar symptoms. And on top of all of that, even in people who have both the presence of amyloid and the clinical symptoms that we associate with Alzheimer's disease, one would expect that if amyloid is the cause of all of this, if you have more amyloid build up over time, it would nice and neatly correlate with the symptoms that you have. That turns out to be a pretty inconsistent relationship. This is pretty well interested in a recent study. This was published pretty within the past year, and they looked at a whole bunch of different neuropathological studies. So these are autopsy studies where they take brains of people who have passed away, whether or not they had clinical symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, and they went and looked in a fine level of detail as to what kind of pathology was there. Over on the right here, so there were 4,600 or so brains that were analyzed in this. Over on the right is just a reminder of the buildup of pathology in the hippocampus that I mentioned to you. So over here on the left, so the orange bar here is depicting these more mild stages of pathology. The blue line here and circle up here is representative of these more severe stages of pathology in the brain. It turns out that a lot of people, about 30% or so, who have amyloid and this tau protein in the brain have never had any kind of abnormal memory impairment or clinical Alzheimer's disease. The flip side of that, of course, is people who do have that are at higher risk for it, but it's really not it's not a perfect relationship. Part of the complicating factor of this is that there are many other neurodegenerative disorders other than Alzheimer's disease. We tend to separate them into separate diseases, but there's really a lot of overlap. So Alzheimer's is the most common, people over 65 or so, but there's also something we call Lewy body disease, frontotemporal dementia, a bunch of other ones. Vascular dementia classically is related to strokes, but really there's a spectrum of that, and we see a lot of vascular pathology in the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease, and many people have a mixed dementia. So another recent study that looked at about 1,200 brains or so cataloged all the different kinds of neuropathological changes, and less than half of them had pure Alzheimer's disease, and the majority of them had some degree of mixed pathology, either including vascular changes or Lewy body or others. So here's the bottom line, summarizing some of what we talked about. So we're actually able to detect the presence of amyloid long before people have clinical symptoms. And there's a lengthy prodromal phase before people who are going to develop the symptoms do develop those symptoms. But then the question is, really, are there other factors involved? It seems that amyloid, of course, is very important, but maybe it's not the only factor. Maybe there's some factor that precedes the buildup of amyloid that then leads to everything else, or maybe it's even more complicated than that. Maybe there is or isn't some factor that comes before amyloid, but maybe it's not this neat progression. Maybe these changes affect each other in various ways that we don't fully understand yet. So again, getting back to these observations about aging, amyloid's likely not the whole story. I think it's becoming pretty clear that that's the case, but it's very important risk factor for dementia. But it raises questions about what Alzheimer's disease actually is. It's causing us to really rethink these things. So there's a lot of big questions. These days, since there isn't this neat relationship between the buildup of the known pathology and getting the disease, we're really starting to think about risk for Alzheimer's disease. So what other factors are there that increase somebody's risk for Alzheimer's disease? The other way to think about that, so risk and resiliency are kind of two sides of the same coin. The other way to think about it is, well, what factors might make one person more resilient to developing clinical or biological Alzheimer's disease than somebody else? And then, of course, for us as clinicians, we always want to know, well, how can we reduce risk for Alzheimer's disease and or promote resiliency against advanced cognitive brain aging or even Alzheimer's disease? So this is a big problem, big worldwide problem. Alzheimer's disease is not going away anytime soon, left unchecked. And in fact, current projections are, this was a 2015 study, but it hasn't changed too much. The current trajectory is that by 2050, the number of people living with Alzheimer's disease will triple. And of course, no discussion of public health like this is without discussing the economic impact on society. This cost of Alzheimer's disease is also going to skyrocket to the tune of 1.1 trillion or so by 2050. The good news is estimates currently also figure that if by 2025, for example, if we were to come up with some kind of a treatment that could even aside from being able to have a cure for Alzheimer's disease, which of course we'd all want, but if we even came up with something that could simply delay the onset of Alzheimer's disease, even just by 5 years, it could potentially save $367 billion by 2050. And as this graph depicts here, rather than the inevitable tripling of the number of people living with Alzheimer's, it might really flatten the curve. So this brings us to our current state. So we're really starting to think about risk and resiliency for Alzheimer's disease much more. And I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of, this is not an exhaustive list of risk factors for Alzheimer's disease, but for the sake of our discussion, these are relevant points to dimension. So one way to think about risk factors for Alzheimer's disease is some things you're just born with them and there isn't a whole lot you can do about it. Your genes, you're born with your genes, not a lot you can do about that. And so if you have a family history of Alzheimer's disease, it increases your risk. A lot of that is related to your genetics. There's this one particular gene that we think about a lot called ApoE that I'll get to in a little bit. Also gender and your ethnicity are things that you're born with and can't necessarily change. But there are other risk factors that are potentially modifiable, meaning you're not born with them, they're not inevitable, and they're things that we could effectively change your risk if we address them. So you could potentially modify your risk if you address these risk factors, meaning, in other words, you could possibly make someone more resilient against cognitive decline. So that's where we're looking at these days. Age is typically the #1 risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, your chronological age. So typically we say that people around 65, when often the first symptoms are becoming noticeable, about 3% of the population will be living with Alzheimer's disease. That increases substantially. So by the time you get to be about 85, there's about a 32% chance of having Alzheimer's disease. I've put amyloid, tau, and other pathologies here in parentheses because these aren't classically thought of as risk factors, but for the sake of our discussion, we're going to consider them as risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. These risk factors that you're born with that I mentioned, they're really, you can't really think of risk factors in isolation. They really, they all depend on the context. So it's really an individual risk based on a lot of different factors. Generally speaking, the presence of the form of ApoE gene that we call ApoE4, having a first-degree family member with Alzheimer's disease, being female and being African American or Hispanic compared with white or Asian populations in our country puts you at higher risk for Alzheimer's disease. But it's a lot more complicated than that. So this is ApoE, ApoE4 gene that I told you about. So if you look at people who have the ApoE4 gene versus people who do not, if you follow people over time, your probability of having Alzheimer's disease, depending on your age, people who have the ApoE4 gene have a much higher risk for getting Alzheimer's disease as they age as people who don't. This graph, I think this is a recent study, and I think this pretty neatly describes some of the complexity of this. So just to orient you to this graph, there's a bunch of people who are followed over time, and this is a cognitive test score. So if you're scoring up here, you're scoring relatively normally. Down here is pretty poor performance. So everybody started off about the same. All right. So if you look at the bottom of the graph here, these are all the people who have amyloid in their brain. So they have biological evidence of Alzheimer's disease. So clearly, the people who have amyloid in their brain end up doing a lot worse than the people who don't. And if you break this up into people who are female or male, you can see that females over time tend to decline faster than or more than males do. They're greater risk for decline. And to further complicate things, we see the same pattern in both males and females. If you happen to carry one of these ApoE4 genes, you end up doing worse off than people who don't in both cases. So ApoE, this is a whole other side to the ApoE story. So what I didn't tell you is there are 3 different versions of this gene that we're concerned with: ApoE2, ApoE3, and ApoE4. ApoE2 is actually considered to be protective against Alzheimer's disease. ApoE4 is the risk factor, and ApoE3 is considered to be relatively neutral risk. You also have 2 copies of most of your genes. One set of your genes comes from your mother, one comes from your father. So you have various combinations of 2, 3s, and 4s that you can have. So it turns out if you have 2 copies of the ApoE gene for any given age, so this is the percent of people any given age who are free from dementia. So for example, at age 80, if you have 2 copies of the protective ApoE2 gene, the percentage of people that are free from dementia is pretty high, versus if you go down bottom of the graph here, if you have 2 copies of the ApoE4 gene, the percentage of people who are free from dementia by the time you get to be 80 is pretty low. Between those two, actually, most people who have Alzheimer's disease have this combination here. So they'll have 1 copy of the ApoE4, 1 copy of the ApoE3, and they've got about an intermediate risk between those two. I mentioned that race and ethnicity are also pretty strong risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. People who are of Black or Native American or Latino background are at higher risk for developing Alzheimer's disease than whites or Asians and other groups. And we don't fully understand all of the details for this yet, but as you can guess, I'm going to say it's very complicated, but there are a lot of factors. Health inequities. African Americans tend to be more prone to vascular disease, vascular risk factors. So we think that that's an important factor, but there's a lot that goes into it. Now, vascular risk factors. So this is an important part of the talk, and it's going to lead into one of the interventions that I'm going to discuss later. Vascular risk factors, what do I mean by that? These are things like high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes, smoking, low levels of physical activity. These probably sound familiar to you as risk factors for heart disease and stroke. And that's where the term comes from. They're vascular risk factors. And we're getting a much better sense for how vascular risk factors may affect your risk for dementia. So one way to think about vascular risk for dementia, you can get strokes. There's lots of ways you can have diseases of the blood vessels of the brain. This is a brain MRI. This is what we call microvascular disease, where the tiniest blood vessels of the brain are affected over time. And we very, very often in the clinic, when we're looking at MRI brains of people with clinical Alzheimer's syndrome, very, very often see some degree of microvascular disease as well. Part of the reason for this is because the brain is absolutely loaded with blood vessels. The brain needs lots of blood, it has a huge blood supply, and the blood vessels that run through the brain, depicted here, are in very intimate contact with a variety of brain cells. So the brain is a kind of a special organ in the body in that it requires a really specialized environment. So there's something called the blood-brain barrier that its job throughout life is to make sure that things that the brain needs in its own environment stay in there, things that don't need to be in there are kept out, and that waste removal happens the way it's supposed to happen. But one of the theories of what happens in aging is that this blood-brain barrier becomes defective over time. So why would vascular risk factors, other than the fact that your brain has lots of blood vessels, be important? So the collection of vascular risk factors, all those things that I mentioned, it's not simply that you have high blood pressure or your cholesterol numbers are high. There's really a lot of physiologic stress that happens with all the factors that lead to these vascular risk factors. So really your body's quite sick, and this is happening at a cellular level, and it's affecting really your entire body. And if you think about it, your brain is as much a part of your body as your heart or anything else. And at the core of many of these vascular risk factors is inflammation. And actually at the core of Alzheimer's disease in many ways is inflammation. So that's potentially one of the big links between vascular risk factors and Alzheimer's disease, is this link of inflammation. So in recent years, there've been a lot of really interesting studies that are really starting to demonstrate that just how much vascular risk factors affect your risk for eventual Alzheimer's disease or dementia. And the really important fact about this that comes up over and over again in the studies, and I'm just going to illustrate 2 of many here, is the fact that vascular risk, so poor vascular health early on, midlife, when you have absolutely no signs of memory problems, increases your risk for Alzheimer's disease many years later. So in this study, what they did is they took a group of people, a lot of people, almost 200,000 people in the United Kingdom, and followed them over time for 7 or 10 years or so. They grouped people in terms of their genetic risk, a little bit different from the ApoE gene that I showed you, but generally group people into low, medium, and high genetic risk. And then amongst each of those categories, they then grouped people into those who had a healthy, favorable lifestyle, people who had an unhealthy or unfavorable lifestyle, and people who were somewhere in between. And the pattern is, regardless of what their genetic risk was, if you have a poor lifestyle, you are at higher risk for eventual clinical Alzheimer's disease than people with the same genetic risk who have a better lifestyle. You can see that same pattern repeated here. The flip side of that is that people, regardless of their genetic risk, if you have a healthy lifestyle, you are at lower risk for developing dementia eventually than people in your same genetic risk category. So that's clinical dementia. What about the presence of amyloid? Similar idea. This study was done a little bit of a different way. They followed people for 20 years. And I'm just going to talk about this top part of the graph here. They looked at people who had 0, 1, or more than 2 vascular risk factors at baseline, and then 20 or so years later, they did a scan and looked for amyloid in the brain. And people who had more vascular risk factors were at increased chance of having amyloid in the brain compared to people who had no vascular risk factors. And the intermediate ones were somewhere in between. So if that wasn't bad enough, midlife vascular health affecting your chance for dementia decades later, we're setting the dial back even further. Some more recent studies are showing that it might even be the case starting in your 20s. So the way we're starting to conceptualize risk factors, we're really starting to understand that this is a disease that's one way or another a lifetime in the making. Starting off when you're young with the genes you have, your race, your ethnicity, and all of these things. Education is also considered to be a big factor. Less education puts you at higher risk. More education makes you more resistant. We actually call that cognitive reserve. And then throughout life, these other risk factors exert influence at particular points in your life, as depicted here. The important part is, the really important part for the purposes of this discussion is that current estimates are that somewhere around 35% of your overall risk for Alzheimer's disease is potentially modifiable. You take a look on the left over here, this depicts a bunch of risk factors and proposed preventive strategies, and exercise sits pretty squarely in the middle here because really, you think about all the biological changes that happen with vascular risk factors that I mentioned to you, exercise and healthy diet and all these things are really the counterweight to all of that. So for the remainder of the study, I'm going to highlight 2 major efforts for prevention strategies that are being launched nationally, internationally, and actually locally. Those are related to prevention strategies, targeting these risk factors, particularly amyloid and vascular risk factors in people who are cognitively normal, who we feel are at higher risk for eventual Alzheimer's disease for a variety of reasons. And the idea is to see can we reduce someone's risk by targeting these risk factors for Alzheimer's disease and/or promote resiliency. So part 1 of this last part of the talk, can targeting the buildup of this toxic amyloid protein prevent clinical Alzheimer's disease? Back to our now very familiar graph. So the theory behind this is that the buildup of this amyloid, whether or not there's something else before that, is an important initiator. And we know there's a lot of studies showing that the presence of amyloid really influences the presence of tau buildup and everything. So this is obviously a very important factor. So we have to figure out whether or not targeting the buildup of this amyloid in people's brains can prevent dementia. So the idea would be we block or slow down the buildup of this amyloid, and it blocks this whole process. So what makes this feasible for us these days is we can actually, rather than looking at neuropathological slides of people who are deceased with Alzheimer's disease, we can actually detect the presence of amyloid using scans. So this shows what we call an amyloid PET scan. These are people who have amyloid and who have dementia, have Alzheimer's disease. You can see it's lighting up brightly with red there. That's what a positive amyloid PET scan looks like. These are what negative amyloid PET scans look like, so we can actually detect the presence of Alzheimer's disease in living people, which is a huge advance in recent years. The other side of this is we can actually selectively target the removal of amyloid. We use what are called antibodies. These are naturally occurring in the body. Their job is to flag things that don't belong in your body for removal. We can actually engineer them to selectively tag anything we want for removal, and in this case, they've been engineered to tag amyloid for removal. So the idea is you've got people that are along this continuum of normal cognition who have varying amounts of amyloid in the brain. And so we can scan people who are cognitively normal, so no memory or thinking problems, and we can assess them for their risk for Alzheimer's disease by seeing whether they have relatively low levels, but elevated, but relatively low, versus people who have very high levels who look like they're on the verge of mild cognitive impairment and dementia. And the idea would be if we can remove or slow down the production of this amyloid, that we can essentially shut down this entire process, or at the very least slow it down. Again, if we slowed it down by 5 years, it would make a huge impact on future generations. That's called the AHEAD trial. We're actually conducting that at our center. We're enrolling people who have no memory or thinking problems, but they are at somewhat increased risk for Alzheimer's disease. Either they know they've got a family history, or they know that they've got this ApoE gene, the ApoE4 gene that's positive. And the idea is just what I said. Give them infusions of this amyloid antibody, follow them over time, and see if we can bend the curve, so to speak, with their risk to Alzheimer's disease. So the final part of this talk is part 2 here. Can we use an intensive lifestyle intervention to protect cognitive function, thereby promoting resiliency and reducing the risk for cognitive decline? There's actually a fair amount of evidence for this that's been garnered over time indirectly. So vascular risk factors have been targeted for prevention in other fields for quite some time. Cardiologists, stroke doctors have really been hammering away at this for a long time, and it's been noticed over time. If you look over on the right here, so for each age group, the gray bar represents the estimated prevalence of Alzheimer's disease in the 90s versus the early 2000s. And you can see for each age group in the 2000s compared to the 90s, there are fewer people with Alzheimer's disease. And the idea is that really aggressively targeting these lifestyle risk factors has not only affected people's risk for heart disease and stroke, but also for Alzheimer's disease. Getting back to our conception here, it's real clear that vascular health is important. And one thing that we think about is this inflammation that I mentioned. There's actually a term called inflammaging that we use. So it's a big part of aging in general, and healthy versus non-healthy aging, affecting your biology on a fundamental level. And so that's all well and good, but can you actually modify these vascular risk factors and prove that it can decrease someone's risk for dementia? Turns out that that's already been done. There's a now famous study called the FINGER trial. It was done in Finland, a Finnish geriatric study. And what they did was they took a bunch of people who were at the age that's the highest risk for developing Alzheimer's disease in their 60s and 70s. They had increased vascular risk. They had did a little bit worse on memory testing than people ordinarily would. And they did what we call a multi-domain intervention, where they, rather than picking your diet or your exercise or lowering blood pressure, they really they addressed all of the vascular risk factors and wanted it in an intensive fashion. And what they found was it actually worked, to a certain degree. People on that intervention, when they were followed 5 or 7 years later, and this is still ongoing, they're still collecting the data, but there was a good signal that this was actually working and slowing the course or people's risk for overall cognitive decline. And the interesting thing, I told you that your risk for Alzheimer's disease is complex, but there was, even though it didn't affect everybody the same way, there was some improvement regardless of people's gender, age, education, vascular profile, and their baseline cognitive performance. So this was so successful that it's spawned kind of a revolution globally. It's called worldwide fingers. There are a bunch of countries throughout the world that are in the process of replicating this effort, including the US. So the finger-like trial that's happening in the US is called US Pointer. There are 5 sites in the whole country, and Rhode Island happens to be lucky enough to be one of them. So it's the same idea. They're going to take a couple of groups of people, slightly different lifestyle interventions, but again, it's this multi-domain idea. So intensive effort at reducing vascular risk as much as possible and following people over time and seeing if it reduces their risk for cognitive decline and increases resiliency. You're generally looking for people who are 60 to 79, don't exercise regularly because you want to see if fixing that reduces your risk. And again, these are people who don't have any memory or thinking problems, but are at increased risk. Maybe they have a family history of Alzheimer's disease or such. And you get lifestyle coaching, you get regular memory checkups. It's a pretty rigorous study, and it's a game changer in our field. This is the first of its kind in the US, and this whole approach is at this scale is novel in Alzheimer's research. And the important thing is it's being conducted in the same rigorous manner that we do drug trials. So people are randomized into one kind of intervention or another and followed with the same scientific rigor that we do with pharmacological studies. So to sum things up and some things I would like you to consider, I'm also a doctor and I want to make sure that you're taking care of yourselves. So education is hugely important. So hopefully you've got a little bit of a flavor of how we think about risk for Alzheimer's disease, just enough of an understanding of what it is, understand the complexity of that and why we think about risk, and why diagnosing it and treating it is as complex as it is. And hopefully you have an understanding for the importance of conceiving of resiliency against premature cognitive aging and dementia. And, given that, we're pretty sure at this point that one way or another, Alzheimer's disease is a lifetime in the making. So it's really important to stay informed because health decisions that you make right now, even in your 20s, may drastically affect your risk for developing Alzheimer's disease many, many years and decades later. So please, please take care of yourself to the best you can. So we're really at a turning point here. All these efforts that I'm talking about, and there's a lot more obviously that's going on, but we're really paving a way for a better understanding, a really integrated understanding of what Alzheimer's disease is. And the way I see it, and a lot of us do, is moving much more toward an individualized model of risk assessment and prevention efforts. But the only way we can do that is through research and all this amazing data that we have the benefit of having right now. Of course, there's researchers and doctors like myself everywhere, but literally none of it would be possible if it weren't for the gracious commitment of our research volunteers. We're partners with them. It's really a team effort, and literally it's impossible without it. So if you have any interest in it all, I would highly encourage you to look into contributing to Alzheimer's research. There's all kinds of ways you can do it. It doesn't necessarily have to do with being in a therapeutic trial. Lots of ways you can contribute. And you probably don't know this, maybe some of you do who follow this enough, but actually Rhode Islanders, you out there throughout the history of Alzheimer's research have made major, major contributions, as well as our doctors, of course. So Rhode Island is a well-known site in terms of Alzheimer's research, and we really hope you help us keep up the tradition. If you do have questions or interested in hearing about more, if you're interested in hearing about the study where we're targeting amyloid removal or any of those kinds of treatments, you can certainly call us at Rhode Island Hospital. If you're specifically interested in the Pointer trial that's being conducted across town at Butler Hospital, So you can contact them. And actually, the Alzheimer's Association is the major driving force behind the Pointer trial coming to the US. And there's lots of information on their website. I've also left a couple of other links at the bottom here, particularly useful documents for you to peruse, and they can all be found on the Alzheimer's Association website. Here's a list of my references if you'd like more information on the more technical stuff. And I thank you very much for your time.